Wow. It's a big room. Get used to it. Welcome to the March 18th, 2019 meeting of the Arlington Redevelopment Board. We have a public hearing for 2019 annual town meeting this evening. As I shouted out a few times, we have a sign-in sheet in the back. I'd ask that everybody please sign in, let us know you're here. There's also a box on there to indicate whether you would like to speak. I'm going to call down the list just like I did last week. If you were here, it keeps the meeting moving, keeps things orderly as we go through public comment period. Tonight we're going to go through Articles 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 first. Staff is going to give a presentation. We're going to move right into public comment period. When you go to public comment, I'd ask that everybody please be respectful, wait for your turn. No side talk, no comments, no applause, no booing. Anyone who's going to speak is going to be asked to use the microphone at the podium up here, state your name and address, and learn the rules again when we get to that. Tonight, I'm asking people only focus on the articles at hand, which are 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. We're going to bring Article 21 up after we're through with those because those are complementary articles. Staff is going to present that. Comment will relate only to those articles. If you have a comment on another article, please hold it. Next week, March 25th, we're going to have a hearing on Articles 15, 16, 23, 24, and 25. That night will conclude the open public comment period. Anyone who wishes to speak on any article will be allowed to do so that night at the close of the meeting. Wednesday night, the 27th, the board, we have another meeting scheduled. That is for board deliberation. We will not be allowing public comment until after the votes are taken. I will allow written public comment up to the time of the meeting, which is 7:30 on the 27th. So, with that, I'm going to stop for a second. You'll notice that we are down to 4 members this evening. Andy West has left the board and left Arlington after a long and distinguished tenure on the board, and I just want to take this opportunity in the public setting to thank him for his years of service and his dedication to the Arlington Redevelopment Board, other subcommittees and committees on which he served, Arlington as a whole, and assisting me through my tenure as chair. I already miss him. We'll miss him as we move through this, and as projects come about. He was a really great help and a good voice, always gave unique and interesting opinions, and I thank him for that. So, that you can applaud. He will be missed. So moving into Articles 10 through 14, I'm going to hand it over to Jenny Raitt.
Good evening. I'm Jenny Raitt. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town. And I'm going to walk us through the Articles 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And then we'll have time for public comment, as you know. So a quick introduction to the articles. Behind me is the map of the zones where we are specifically talking about this type of development that we're going to go into a little bit further. So these are the medium and high density residential districts. They are R4, R5, R6, R7, and then all of the business districts, which are all highlighted on this map. As you can see, predominantly the main transportation corridors in town, as in Massachusetts Avenue, Summer Street, Broadway, and then other corridors as well, but primarily those. I wanted to share with you how we got here. Again, I did talk a little bit about this last week, for those of you who didn't get to tune into that hearing, and if you want to take a look at it, all of this is all on the Redevelopment Board's webpage. You can see all of the ACMi videos through the ACMi page. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I would encourage you to, because I went through a lot more about the background of the articles, as well as walking through the other articles that relate to mixed use and multifamily uses. So I wanted to walk through how we got to the place where we did with the master plan. Some of you in the room may have participated in that process. Others may not have. There were lots of opportunities to participate over a two and a half year process before the plan was actually adopted in 2015. There was a great deal of public feedback that led into that, as I said, and most of it, I'm picking out pieces that we heard through the drafting. There were preliminary drafts issued and feedback that was provided to the department as part of that process, as well as the Master Plan Advisory Committee. It all talked about things along the lines of encouraging new housing in mixed-use properties, encouraging new development that is affordable to multiple incomes, focusing denser development along our commercial corridors, and encouraging a mix of unit sizes for varying household types. We also heard that people wanted to mix housing in workplaces, shops, and other uses, which could benefit owners, users, and residents. That one-story buildings along the commercial corridors are a poor use of space, that they could be built up rather than out. People didn't want to see sprawl, they wanted to see denser, more compact development. People also commented that the cost of parking is often the greatest hindrance to economic feasibility of denser urban development, and that they wanted to address that through the master plan process. They also talked about allowing increased density through infill housing and conversion to multi-unit dwellings, as well as relaxing off-street parking requirements in areas that are closer to commercial areas. So those are some of some of the highlights of feedback that we received in relationship to housing and economic development. And it led to a series of recommendations. The master plan is a document that has lots of information in it that outlines an entire process, that also outlines and captures describing the threats and opportunities to the whole entire town of Arlington across multiple categories: housing, transportation, economic development, and land use, and open space and natural resources. It led to specific recommendations. The recommendations are actually the most important part of that plan, because that's what the Master Plan Implementation Committee is mostly focused on, and advancing those to move forward through multiple subgroups. So the Master Plan recommendations, I want to talk about how those directly relate to these amendments that we're talking about. They talked about things like promoting the development of higher value mixed-use buildings by providing redevelopment incentives in all or selected portions of the business districts on Mass Ave, Broadway, and Medford Street, which means these amendments are meant to unlock the potential development in business districts and build on the previous amendments for mixed use. Supporting vibrant commercial areas by encouraging new mixed-use development. Amendments are building again on the amendments that we made in 2016 to mixed-use development. Establishing parking ratios that reflect an actual need for parking. These amendments would reduce the parking ratios for multifamily and mixed use with access to transit. Amending the on-site open space requirements for certain uses in business districts to promote high-value development and alternative green areas such as roof gardens. The amendments create flexibility in meeting the open space requirements of the zoning bylaw for multifamily and mixed use. More on this. Encourage mixed-use development that includes affordable housing, primarily in well-established commercial areas. Amendments focus on development in zoning districts along the commercial corridor. The affordability is triggered when you reach 6 or more units in a development. Provide a variety of housing options for a range of incomes, ages, families, sizes, and different needs. The amendments are seeking to increase diversity of the housing stock. To create affordability, it means you also create the options for market rate housing. The two go hand in hand, and that's why these things deal with a variety of housing options. Preserve the streetcar suburb character of Arlington's residential neighborhood, the streetcar suburb being the streetcar of days past. Amendments do not affect low-density residential zoning districts. We are focused on R4 and up, and the business districts. Encourage sustainable construction and renovation of new and existing structures. The amendments are meant to encourage investment in older buildings. And by that, it also means that future development would come back to this board. Each one would come back to be reviewed and permitted through a whole separate review process, which then applies the environmental design review special permitting that we already have as part of the board's jurisdiction. Setbacks and other dimensional and design standards should be adjusted to facilitate infill development. The amendments are meant to adjust those setbacks and dimensional standards to be appropriate for the higher density residential districts and business districts. And then the town's off-street parking regulations need to be overhauled and modernized to address current trends in land use, economic development, and transportation planning. So the reduction of the number of spaces per unit for multifamily uses is meant to reflect that fact. A housing production plan was a process that we engaged in after the master plan was adopted, as per one of the recommendations of the master plan. And that had a lot of feedback as well. We had 2 forums, we had multiple stakeholder meetings and focus groups, which led to the adoption of the plan in 2016 by both the Select Board and the Arlington Redevelopment Board. And that feedback included people talking about the need to amend the zoning to allow more mixed use, encourage housing development around the business districts, and create small houses and developments on infill parcels. Most groups favored creating mixed-use development or updating to allow for more construction. Participants expressed a desire to maintain the walkability of Arlington and to create villages throughout the town so that all residents could enjoy that walkability and proximity to shops and businesses. Housing development should be concentrated along public transportation routes, providing residents access to business districts. The mandate to provide more than necessary parking per unit of housing reduces the already limited amount of redevelopable land in Arlington, and that shared parking and reduced parking requirements per unit of housing should be allowed. As we've stated in previous meetings, we're behind the curve in terms of production, which is leading to the fact that we have greater housing costs in this town. 1 in 3 households spend more than 30% of their income on housing in Arlington. There are low-income seniors who are spending an even higher proportion of their income on housing. And sales prices rise faster than income. More than 1 in 4 households in Arlington have low incomes. So we want to address those issues through these mixed-use and multifamily amendments. We also want to be clear that this is intended to promote and support the sustainability goals that the town has set. How? Because we're looking at a compact built environment, which ultimately would reduce emissions and vehicular use. We're also talking about focusing growth where development and infrastructure already exists, and putting homes, jobs, stores, schools, and other destinations in close proximity to each other for easier access. So Articles 10, 11, and 12 include the upper story building step backs, which is basically the part of the building that would go back at the 3rd story or above. And it can be adjusted to be consistent with the increase in height limits for mixed use and multifamily uses, and could be proportionally appropriate for wider streets, as in parts of Mass Ave, which are currently very wide. The height buffer, which we're talking about at Article 11, is meant to be continued to provide a reasonable degree of relief for nearby lower density residential districts, but not effectively to lower the allowable height across the entire property. And then lastly, the corner lot, which is Article 12, would mean that the corner lot would align with the frontage that's required in that zoning district where the parcel is located, rather than in relationship to adjacent parcels only. So this is the language related to these articles. Now I'm going to switch to parking quickly. Parking demand. I think I've already highlighted that in the master plan and even the housing production plan, parking was discussed quite a bit as being an impediment. And if you build it, they will come, or they will park, unfortunately. Oversupply of parking reduces other land uses. An average lot in town is about 74% utilized. If you have job accessibility by transit within 30 minutes, it actually reduces the parking demand, and we have that here in Arlington. Establishing a minimum based on market factors, more parking can be built. So a parking study was conducted for the town as well as with other communities in Metro Boston, looking at parking utilization in these 6 particular locations in town. This notes where those locations are, when they were built, how parking was currently utilized based upon that study, and then how much excess parking was identified. And on average, there was almost an excess of half of a space, essentially, overarchingly, on average. The vehicle ownership in Arlington actually continues to go down. There's 1.42 cars owned per household in town. It is not more than that. And the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled per household, is also changing. While it is not nearly as high as it once was in 2009, it is not as low as it was in 2010. We have more to go, but we want to reduce the vehicle miles traveled per household. That's part of our overall sustainability goals in town. Same thing with household miles per day that are traveled. So the Articles 13 and 14 directly address these parking requirements. One is related to the parking units per dwelling unit, parking spaces per unit rather, which is reducing it to 1 for 1 rather than 1 or more per bedroom, so or higher than that. And then Article 14 reduces the applicability of the parking reduction to include R7, which was something that was discussed in 2016 as part of the mixed-use zoning and parking reduction that was granted at that time. So with that, I think we're going to pause actually here and take comment.
I have the list. We have the list from the back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I see the slide with the parking ownership, our ownership of the town. What's that face on?
I'll wait for the chair to return.
Yeah, just back.
All right, so as I said, I'm going to call names off the list. If you've said yes and you've changed your mind, just say pass. I apologize in advance for butchering anyone's name. When I call your name, please step up to the podium. Please keep your comments brief and within the scope of the articles being discussed now, which are 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. If you'd like to discuss the other amendments, like I said, there'll be time for you to do that Monday night, or you can do so in writing. I think we have a lot of people that want to speak this evening, so I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to do so. After people are done speaking, I'm going to move right on to the next name. No applause, no comments, no booing. Don't interrupt anyone. If you wish to speak and you haven't checked yes, raise your hand after everyone's had an opportunity to speak. So first up, I have Ann Thompson. And these are just comments. We're accepting these. The board will have an opportunity to ask questions as we go through these, including reiterating the questions that you have for the staff.
Hi there, I'm Ann Thompson. I'm 14 Cottage Ave, Arlington resident for 28 years, more than half my life now. I haven't had a chance to make it to many of these meetings, but I find a lot of issues with the zoning changes in general. The specific ones we're discussing tonight, not as much so. The setback one, yes, a couple others, but I wanted just to leave my name because I'd like to be involved in this, okay? I know that's not quite. I am a planner. I teach real estate economics and real estate finance at MIT in their Center for Real Estate. Been there for many years. And given my research, I also work with Nobel Prize winner Bob Schiller on housing economics and stuff. Given my research, I know a lot of this does not hold weight in terms of what the purposes they say are, for this new zoning changes. So I am more here to let people know that I'd like to help you out, limited because I'm teaching a lot, but I've got my card, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Nope. Shayna Cleveland.
Sorry. Good evening, I'm Shanna Cleveland. I live at 98 Highland Avenue here in Arlington, and I want to thank the ARB and the town of Arlington for doing such a detailed and thorough planning process. The master plan is based on what I have seen to be some of the most thorough analysis and public processes that I've seen in a city to undertake this type of analysis. I have worked on environmental and climate issues for over a decade here in New England, and I'm very happy to be in a town where we were part of a over 2 year long process to develop a master plan that then looked at how we could meet the goals set forth in that master plan, both for sustainability and affordability for our town through changes to the zoning laws. And as someone who is very focused on the need for us to have a walkable city, a city that allows for people who can't afford to spend 30 to 40% of their income on housing, I support all of these changes. I'm especially excited to see the changes around parking and bicycle parking, as someone who, again, is very concerned about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also making it a more livable city for people who do not have access to a car all the time. So increasing density along the major transit corridors, preventing sprawl, making sure that developers who are building affordable housing along with market rate housing have the flexibility that they need to be able to make those types of developments is something that I'm really excited about, and that I hope other people in the community will be excited about as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Can you say whether they were actually part of your process and whether they're part of the...
People, I'm not gonna control that. People can just get up and speak about this. If they want to say whether they were part of the process, they may.
Point of order,
John Warden.
it's a town.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. You'll have your turn to speak. Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Worden, Precinct 8 Town Meeting member and longtime observer of zoning issues in this town going back to 1970. Just a couple general comments. The walkability issue is a fine one, and I'm all in favor of that. Do a fair amount of it myself. The public transportation is a great idea. I use that whenever I go into Boston or sometimes other parts of Arlington. It'd be better if we didn't have such lousy bus service. And I'm
Out of scope, Mr. Warden. We have no control over the MBTA in this.
I realize you don't, but you have to. The reality is, if you want to get people out of their cars and on the bus, somebody has to get the buses to run like they did, say, 20 years ago. I'm not asking for a miracle. Just go back to what they used to do. And there are several, and I know you don't control this, but that is one of the problems. That's one of the reasons you've got traffic issues. There's so many people, they can afford it. They drive their car because they don't want to stand in the cold corner like I've done often out here in front of the town hall and wait for a bus that should have come 10 minutes ago. Okay, now I have specific thoughts on these articles that are before us this evening. And I will start with Article 10. The Article 10 deals with reducing the set, right now the zoning, as Ms. Ray pointed out, the zoning bylaw requires that if you go above some height, that top story should be set back by some small number of feet. And that's supposed to make the street wall less overpowering as you walk down the street. What I'm suggesting is that setback ought to apply to the entire top floor, not just the front elevation that faces the street, because behind that commercial building or a high, residential, mixed use, whatever building, there could be somebody's one or two family house. Beside that, maybe there should be a little space, a little air, something like that. So that's what I would suggest with respect to that. The height buffer thing, that is a real, to my mind, a real non-starter. The height buffers is in the present zoning bylaw, were carefully constructed with the compass directions and everything, so that a higher building would not cast a shadow over somebody else's house, somebody else's garden, someone else's lawn, patio, whatever. When this thing was drafted, we hardly ever heard of solar power, but a lot of houses now have solar panels on the roof. and if they have a south-facing or an east-facing roof, they're likely to have solar panels. When they get a shadow, that kind of destroyed. You talk about sustainability. If you're going to put a shadow over somebody's solar panels, those panels are not going to be doing their job. And that's why I think it's important that and that's one of the reasons that I think it's important that the buffers as presently constituted be retained. I mean, Arlington is mostly, I mean, you've got the map here. Most of Arlington is 1 or 2 family houses. That's the business we are in. We're not in the apartment business. We're not in the commercial business. And those people live in those 1 or 2 family houses. It's most of the population. They pay most of the taxes, and they should be protected, not overcome with shadows, so that some developer can make some more money. The change in criteria, there's also the other part of that article would change the criteria of which the relevant board, whether the ZBA or the ARB, would decide about this. And it changes in a way that looks to me like we know what's best. We'll decide if it's good or bad for you, and you can like it or lump it. That's not the way the bylaw is presently written. And I believe the way the bylaw is presently written gives a balance to the interest of the developer and the adjacent nearby property owner, that if he doesn't, if it's not done fairly, he's got a good opportunity to go to court, which I don't think you should have to do. It's unfair that people in this town have to go to court and get a lawyer, and I'm a lawyer myself, but I don't think they should have to go and pay a lawyer to defend the interest that they have in their property. It's not fair. Now, let's get into Article 12. Article 12 is the one that deals with the corner setbacks. On its face, it looks like a good idea. There's a corner, in the residential district, a corner, your house on a corner, you got 2 front yards. Each of them has to be 25 feet. But now envision, if you can, say a corner, let's think of the corner of, it's Winter Street, where Olivio's restaurant, that now has some new name. You know where I mean, in East Arlington. Now the Olivio's restaurant building is a 1-story building, and it's right out, the edge on the side street is right out there. Well, that's not too bad. Behind it, there's a row of houses that are properly set back. If you have a 5-story building there or a 4-story building there, that makes an entirely different thing. And so I'm going to suggest, and I will amend, if you don't fix this, I'll amend it, try to amend it in town meeting, that there'll be a proviso there, provided that the setbacks shall not be less than the average setbacks of the block adjoining the corner lot. And I think that is only fair to the people. Again, it's a situation. We're a small town. We have a commercial spine. They want to make it bigger, and they think better. But the main thing is our houses, our single and 2-family houses that most of us live in. And those deserve to be protected, and those neighborhoods as a whole deserve to be protected. Now, Article 13, that deals with parking. Okay, well, then we come back to the lousy bus service. But if we have 1.4 cars per living unit, and we're only going to require you to have a parking place for 1 of them, where are you going to put that 0.4 car? Maybe if it's only a 0.4 car, putting it in the street isn't too bad an idea. But in reality, you don't have a 0.4 unless you have one of those little mini, those little half cars. They have, and you see a few of them around here. They're about as well. They're about the size of that table. Well, 2 of those tables maybe. They're cute, but I wouldn't like to carry all my groceries home, and there wouldn't be room for me and the dog.
Let's move it along, Mr. Warden, please.
Sorry.
It's funny.
Anyway,
If you want to have a chance to speak, we want him to wrap up.
if we have 1.4 cars per unit, it seems to me to say you only need one parking place per unit, leaves something out. And I think you've got to figure out where you're gonna put those other cars, or those, because you get 2 units, that's almost a full car. It has to be somewhere. Now, the next article also deals with parking, and it's the, no, I'm sorry, that was, no, 14 is 14 also deals with your development board already has the authority under certain circumstances to reduce the quantity of parking required for these buildings. If you meet certain standards, I'm sure you know that, you've probably done that. It says you should reduce them to 25%, or you can. I would say, I don't know how you interpret that, it seems to me you should say you could reduce them up to, or down to maybe 25%. But in any event, since you have that authority and you want to add another district where you will have that authority, I don't see why you need the previous article. It seems to me it becomes moot. You already can do it in the right circumstances. At least there's some possibility of some guidelines that it won't just be arbitrarily put out there. Okay, that is all I wanted to say about these articles, except I just want to say, again, in general, reference this article in Boston Magazine that says we're one of the nicest places to live in, one of the best towns to live in. And again, I say, please, let's keep it that way. Thank you.
Winnell Evans.
Figure out how to get back to the ground.
So, I will, okay.
Winnell Evans, Orchard Place. I just want to reiterate a comment that I made last week because I think it's so important, which is that we're looking at a huge wave of displacement for the residents of these properties that will be subject to redevelopment. Most of them are tenants. All of this is going to hit the tenants of our town really, really hard. When these people are displaced, by the time the building is redeveloped, they will, I hope, have found someplace else to live. Will they be able to come back at anything even approaching the same rents they were previously paying? I think it's extremely unlikely. My other comment is for the mixed use part of this, we have so many empty storefronts in Arlington Center right now. And the new building that's been built at 887 Mass Ave, as far as I can tell, the apartments on the second and third floor are occupied, but the ground floor is still empty. And I'm very curious about what the town has in mind to draw these new small businesses into town, because this is a huge component. Otherwise, we're just going to be adding more empty storefronts. So those are my comments, and thank you.
Thank you. Steve Moore.
A lot of wires to step over. Steve Moore, I live on Piedmont Street. I also want to thank the Arlington Community Development Board for all of their hard work. This is a tough, long process, and clearly there's a lot of interest here trying to deal with the balance here, so thank you for that. Also want to thank folks that contributed to the whole master planning effort that went on a couple of years ago. That's significant, and it was large. The housing production plan, also another significant, large, tough effort of balance. The master plan yielded a bunch of goals and, well, recommendations and goals that led toward the eventual development of the housing production plan. The master plan has many goals in it. Housing is only one of them. I believe that comment was made last week, and I want to echo it again, that there's a whole number of goals that the master plan has for the town, as and housing is one, but only one. Arlington is physically a small town, and it's a town, it's not a city, it's a town. It doesn't have a large geographic area. Maintaining that town flavor is clearly the goal that we've heard from a number of folks tonight, as well as over the past few weeks, last week actually. The master plan and the housing production plan are paper documents that yield actions, and now we're getting to the action part, where the rubber meets the road in terms of what it is that these things mean when they move from paper to reality. And I think for the first time, people are now hearing what that really means in terms of to be sustainable, to have housing affordable to all, to have lots of mixed use. Now we're hearing about what it means. And I think you're hearing both tonight and a week ago and at some of the earlier forums that it means quite a bit that is surprising people. And in many cases, for the first time, surprising people who were not involved in the master plan or the housing production plan efforts. Again, necessary, admirable efforts, but now I think you're hearing more from citizenry that maybe we're not part of that. Now, again, housing is an admirable goal. We need to move forward with it. But I think we may be hearing and feeling from the comments that I've been part of for the past 2 weeks that this is not quite ready for prime time yet. I know there are articles on the warrant. I know there'll be a fight on town meeting floor about this. But I think that doesn't have to be, and perhaps did not have to be. And if we were to wait a year and go through a marketing effort for the entire year by you folks to sell this plan to the town and modify it, I mean, take some serious comment and look to modify it based on the comment that you hear and the rather lively discussions that I'm sure will come out of that year's worth of marketing to adjust this plan to reflect what the royal we of the town really want now that people are finally hearing where the intent of this is going and what it's going to look like as opposed to what the word said. So, thanks much.
Thank you. Mark Kaplan.
Hi, Mark Epline, Palmer Street, 30-year resident. Precinct 7. Could I see the slide with the vehicles in the town versus population? Because my data is that there's been about 35,000 registered vehicles in the town, and that's been fairly consistent, you know, anywhere between 34 to 38 over time. So the measure here is total population versus total vehicles. If you count households against vehicles, which is kind of how the warrant article is based, there's 19,000 households, and I think the excise tax numbers are 35,000 vehicles, so that's a number about 1.85 vehicles per household. Anyway, but I'm here mostly to talk about parking and the parking study. The parking study just kind of furthers more evidence on how the town will try to deceive the public in order to advance its agendas. That study, has anyone read the study closely? Have you looked at the Excel spreadsheet in detail? So there were only 6 properties for Arlington, which is fewer than any of the other towns. And they were cherry picked. First of all, they excluded all the properties where they found 100% parking utilization with no explanation. We can assume because that doesn't match up with their agenda. And most of the properties they looked at were outliers. Then there's the basis of the study, the premise of having excess parking. I don't know And if you have excess seating in your homes, you know, chairs you don't use every day, not fully occupied, or how many seats in your car are not used every day. But I don't understand how they assume parking spaces are excess. So let me tell you about the parking study. So some of the examples, they chose the Capitol Theater block. And there are 23 housing units there and 5 parking spaces, one of which may be a handicap space, I'm not sure. Anyway, on the evening they counted vehicles. They found 4 vehicles in those 5 spaces. And they said, oh, there's 20% underutilization there. Now, I don't know how you can look at 23 housing units with only 5 parking spaces and say there's excess parking. But yes, that's what they do. Another property they chose was Capitol Square, which is a low-income housing unit. So one might expect underutilization of parking, especially when the building was repurposed. It wasn't always low-income housing. It was built in 1900 or so, and so with parking. Another property they sampled was Brigham Square. That developer purposely added extra parking because there was insufficient parking at the medical building at 22 Mill Street. And so, you know, that was a voluntary increase in parking space. And then another property with a lot of excess parking was Arlington 360. They counted the one apartment building there, the one large apartment building, even though there's many townhouses, and they associated all the outdoor parking with that one apartment building, even though that excess parking is shared by the townhouses and other housing units there. Another point I wanted to make is, you know, another deception about statistics. So the Mass Ave project, the traffic level measured at the Route 16 intersection, the study said that after 10 years, which is now, it would be a 1-minute delay during the morning peak commute to get through that intersection. And in another 10 years, it'll be an extra 15 seconds. And the backup would only be 100 feet or so, and not to the Capitol Theater. So the bus study just completed last year found the delay is more like 5 minutes, not 1 minute. So these are the kind of statistics that we're getting from the town to further their agenda. So the parking study is a complete sham. And again, so here they're counting population against vehicles when they should be counting households against vehicles. So, you know, they're cherry picking the numbers one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Pam Howell.
Hi, I'm Pam Hallett, Executive Director of the Housing Corporation of Arlington. I live at Gilboa Road. I'm a town meeting member. It's really a shame that we sort of point at the town as a sort of a bad guy, when really this kind of information is brought by meetings and has been put together over, I've been back for probably almost 10 years, and every single year there have been meetings about what to do, what kind of housing needs are there, what other kinds of needs are there. We all come together. Every meeting has had minimum 15, more like 50 people in it. Write down what you want, go up, put it in the appropriate place of, is it affordable housing we need to hit? Is it, you know, better economic development? Is it public transit? Where are the primary pieces that the town and the people and the community should be focusing on. And that is where the master plan has come from. And that is where the resulting committee structures have focused on. And that is where these amendments are trying to get to, is the community has said, we need this, and this is what the result is. It's unfortunate that so many people are trying to control what is happening in here, a small group of about 15 people that are trying to control where this goes. It's really unfortunate. In response to the parking, I do manage and run Capitol Square, which is affordable housing. There are 32 units. We were required to do 32 parking spaces, although we tried to convince people that we didn't need it. Any day, morning, noon, night, midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, we have a minimum of 12 spaces left that we don't utilize. We had to actually hire a towing company to be on call because people in the community decided that we had extra spaces so they could come and use it instead. So now we tow. People don't like it, but we tow. Just another expense on our end. Just another thing to look out for, just another piece to pay attention to. So I don't know what your problem is with the parking study. They went ahead and took the major sides, the major buildings that had parking, looked at it, looked at the relationship between the number of people that needed parking and the number of people that actually used it and the number of units, and that's where the parking study came from. It was actually recommended by the committee that this be done so that there could be serious numbers, serious data to look at, because when I first arrived, everybody talked about the fact that there was not enough parking in Arlington, never enough parking. It was talked about at every single committee meeting I ever heard, so we recommended that a study be done. The study's been done, these are results. This is fact, this is data, so use it. And again, the other piece is for the zoning, in order to have fewer empty storefronts, you need to have people and a community that support the businesses that are there. It doesn't matter if you have 10 spaces or you have 100 spaces. If the community is not going to support the businesses that are in the spaces, they're not going to survive. That's what happens. You have a space, you have a small business person that goes into it, whether it's retail or restaurant or whatever. If the community doesn't support it, they will not survive. They will not stay. They will move to a place where there is lots of street traffic, where people will utilize the commercial, retail, and small businesses that are there. So it's not only building the buildings, it's also paying attention as a community and saying, man, I really like that restaurant. I should go to it more than twice a year in order to have it survive. Or I really appreciate the retail being there as a service to me as a community member. Let me do my side and really support it. Without that kind of support, nothing will survive, whether you have 5 units or 30 units or 100 units. That's all I have to say. I really support the zoning amendments as they are here. And I also want to say, Redevelopment Board, good luck in making your decision. And thank you, staff, for doing such a good job in putting this all together. Thank you.
Thank you. Beth Malofchik.
Beth Malofchik. I live on Russell Street in R4, and I am horrified by the.
Can you give your name again?
Beth Malofchik. I live on Russell Street. I actually live in R4, and in one of the dense already zones, and I'm horrified by these proposals. I don't understand why They're touted as, and I have been to many committee meetings since I attended the Orwellian one on January 10th, where we were told, don't worry, it's only Broadway and Mass Ave, it won't touch R2. So you're protecting the green space and open space in yards in part of the town, but not in R4 through R7. I haven't seen representation from R4 through R7 at any of these meetings that I've attended, nor during comments, so I think that's a piece that is missing. There seems to be significant goals missing from the master plan, notably green space and those green corridors that connect our many wonderful neighborhoods. I'm appalled at the potential loss of street trees related to your setbacks. I'm appalled that you disregard the neighbors who already live there and have been paying taxes for decades, if not generations. I live on a street that's akin to a small village. I love it. It's the historic district anchored by the Valvoline. I love to say that. It's a great street, and we've had 4 generations, and we have 3 generations in these homes. And so again, I find appalling the lack of consideration for existing citizens with the specter of 5-story buildings without proper setbacks. It should be all around the entire building. John Warden is correct. The sides and the back, absolutely. So we got the sun, which we don't want to lose. I don't want to see a street canyon or a concrete canyon from Winchester to Belmont, which will happen. Why don't we describe it that way? From Alewife to Lexington, and the contiguous neighborhoods in between. I'm in one of those contiguous neighborhoods. I love it. I love Arlington. I've been here 6 years. And again, the master plan. Where in these articles are the guarantees for affordable housing and small houses in infill? I don't see anything about small houses in infill. I'm all for building in infill. It seems like you took one piece of it and are running away with it, and I don't think that's correct. So I'll end there. You know my opinion.
Thank you. Steve Revelak.
Pass until we get to bicycles.
Okay. Don Seltzer.
May I have some handouts for the board? I'm Don Seltzer. I live on Irving Street, a resident of Arlington for 47 years. I'd like to address Article 11, the revision of the height buffer zones. This bylaw is a very modest protection for homeowners who happen to live near business districts. It sets up a buffer region around them of 100 to 200 feet. Now, it doesn't prevent developers from building there. It just reduces what they can build by 1 story. So instead of a 5-story building in this buffer zone, you can build a 4-story building. Now, our consultants, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, have decided that this is a bit too restrictive for developers. It's unfair to them. What they'd like us to do in this article is to essentially gut the height buffer zone, slash it by 75%. What they say in their own words is, this will provide reasonable relief to the adjacent homeowners. I have no idea by what measure or decision process our consultants decided that this is reasonable relief. These numbers were actually given to us last December, and we were told that eventually the studies for this would come later on. Now, this is kind of backwards to me. I'm an engineer, and our standard practice is we do the studies, and the analysis first, and then we make recommendations for guidelines. They're doing it the other way around. Now, finally, 3 months later, we finally got to see what these visualization studies and shadow studies are. They were distributed just last Monday. I've taken a look at these, and I hate to say it, but these are useless nonsense. There's nothing practical in here. They do not represent any Arlington neighborhoods. They do not represent any Boston area neighborhoods. They're simply fictional neighborhoods in a fictional city. The shadow studies that are also part of it are even worse. They're also in some SimCity fictional neighborhood, and they lack all dimensions. It's of no practical use for figuring out how shadows are going to affect Arlington neighborhoods. All we know from the shadow study is that winter shadows are longer than summer shadows. That's all I got out of it. And so this is really what our taxpayer dollars have been paying for. I came to this meeting with my own little visualization study for a neighborhood. It's rather crude, but at least it has the advantage of being an actual Arlington neighborhood, and it didn't cost the taxpayers a dime. I don't think this is going to quite work out as far as people in the audience being able to see what this is about. So I'm going to give you another quick visualization of a different nature. This neighborhood, by the way, is the East Arlington Business District and the surrounding residential neighborhood on the side streets, such as Chandler Street and Melrose, Egerton. And just pretend that I'm standing on Chandler Street in the house there right behind the business district. I'm standing in the yard, and I'm looking out over the parking lot for the Cambridge Savings Bank that's there. And suppose that this is slated for redevelopment along the lines that these zoning changes propose. Now, the people back there around the 8th row of seats, could someone there just raise their hand if you're in the 8th row? It's about where the clock is, I think. Okay. Now, the people right behind you, if you're a developer, you're in luck. You're beyond the new height buffer zone. You are quite free to erect a 5-story building with balconies overlooking my backyard here on Chandler Street. No restriction on that. That's what these zoning laws mean. Now to the board, I've watched how seriously and professionally you review applications for developers who want to put in a single building on a single lot. One thing you always insist upon is that they provide a good plan which shows the surrounding neighborhood and how this particular building is going to fit in with that neighborhood. If a developer came to you with this kind of data, I think you would politely tell them, well, why don't you go back, do your homework, and come back to us again when you've given us something really useful to evaluate. We're asking tonight that you apply this same standard to reviewing these warrant articles before you decide whether or not they should go forward to the town meeting with your recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve McKenna. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve McKenna, Upland Road. I'd like to restate a few things that Jenny Raitt mentioned earlier. On page 77 of the master plan, it says master plan goals for housing and residential development. The first item, encourage mixed-use development that includes affordable housing primarily in well-established commercial areas. Number 2, provide a variety of housing options for a range of incomes, ages, families, family sizes, and needs. Number 3, preserve the streetcar suburb character of Arlington's residential neighborhoods. And the 4th, encourage sustainable construction and renovation of new and existing structures. That's what the town planning department's approving. Planning and community development, they are not a developer. They're here for you, they're here for everyone in the town. This is about growth and economic opportunities for the businesses that are trying to continue to stay in business and to thrive along Mass Ave, for people to have the opportunity of staying and living in town, that are living in a larger home and they want to live on Mass Ave because now they're aging, they want to be closer to public transportation, closer to Stop and Shop. The ARB, in their decision making, when a developer, whether it is Pam Hallett or a developer that is there for market rate units, every development has to go through a rigorous step and a lot of money, time, and energy to be approved. And I've been going and attending meetings for 35 years at the ARB. I've never seen them steamroll anything to go through the town that would hurt the town. And I'm sorry that I have to say this, but I think there's a lot of fear-mongering going on where people are putting up what they're calling walls of darkness that's going to occur in town of Arlington. If we cannot build along Mass Avenue, Broadway, and Summer Street, where zoning districts are allowed to have the opportunity to build, this town will be devastated in years to come, and the planning department knows that. Lexington, Belmont, Winchester, Medford, and Cambridge have already started developing many, many years ahead of us. They are ahead of us. To Winnell's point, we do have empty storefronts. Most of our storefronts and most of those buildings were built in the 1930s. They're less than 700 or 800 square feet. A business cannot come into Arlington and expect to grow in a 700 square foot building that was built prior to 1930. Many of you, if you're living in a home, and most of you live in homes in Arlington that's built prior to 1930, you've updated your kitchens, you've updated your bathrooms, you've expanded. This is what we're trying to do, and this is what the planning department is trying to do along Mass Ave in a very sensitive, sensible, meaningful way. So when a developer goes in front of the redevelopment board, they have to make sure that they've talked to engineering, they have architectural plans, they'll have parking studies done, they'll have traffic studies done, they'll speak to the fire department, there'll be building inspection reviews, and then you have to go through the ARB, and then every neighbor and anyone in the town will have an opportunity to speak. This is critical for the economic growth of the town of Arlington. As many of you may know, I sell real estate in Arlington. I've been here 35 years. Arlington is known as a AAA community with the people that are coming in here. It's affordable, it's accessible, and it's all-inclusive. If we do not allow this type of urban and opportunity of development, we might as well build a wall around the entire town and stop people from coming in. And I don't think that's what anybody wants. The planning department has spent a lot of time and energy looking at this and putting together an opportunity for this town to grow. If we do not grow, our businesses will leave. There's no other reason why they would want to stay, because they're being outshined by Belmont, Lexington, and Winchester. Lexington is a historical town, so here, well, Arlington's historical as well. Lexington, 10 years ago, redeveloped their center. You do not see vacant storefronts in Lexington Center. You do not see vacant storefronts in Belmont. Arlington has over 7,000 square feet of vacant space right now, and most of those spaces are less than 1,000 square feet. They're older. All of this mixed-use development is an opportunity to generate some income for the town, to generate an opportunity for people who currently live in town to stay here, to create more affordable housing. It's a balance. It's well thought of, it's well heeled, and I'm pleading with the ARB to allow these proposals to go through and for everyone to really rethink what we want to do and have here in the town for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon Prizan.
Hi, my name is Sharon Prezant, and I live at 17 Tanager Street. My comments are general, but I am specifically concerned about the upper story setbacks and the reductions in open space. So the proponents of the amendments might want to consider how many people who presently live in Arlington moved away from the neighboring cities when they moved into Arlington. When my partner and I were ready to buy a home over 30 years ago, we had been living in Cambridge for a number of years. And we actually began looking in Cambridge, and we looked for a house as far as Melrose. But we ended up choosing Arlington ultimately because we preferred the character of the town to the more urban environment that we had been living in. And we chose Arlington because it provided a good balance. If I had moved to Melrose, I wouldn't have been able to walk to Mass Ave, get on a bus, get on a subway, and get into Boston in a reasonable amount of time. I would have been stuck in a suburb. But we also preferred Arlington to the kind of experience we had had when we lived in Cambridge, where the on-street parking and the taller buildings, which cast shadows over sidewalks and neighboring buildings and created wind tunnels, which were not very pedestrian friendly and did not improve walkability, made it a different experience than the experience of living in Arlington. So we left the more crowded urban environment of Cambridge in order to come to Arlington. And I don't just live in Arlington, I also shop in Arlington, I eat out in Arlington, and I frequent our libraries in Arlington. I don't happen to live in one of the zones that are going to be directly affected by these changes. But my experience of living in Arlington isn't limited to my one street, which will not be changed by these zoning proposals. My experience of living in Arlington is also affected by the Mass Ave and the Summer Street and the Broadway corridors because I spend my time in other parts of town, as I said, shopping, eating out, and frequently in libraries, and I'm often driving, taking the bus, or walking in those other areas of town. And I think Arlington, people chose Arlington, people who have been paying taxes here for many years, whether they are renters paying them indirectly or homeowners, people chose Arlington because the way the town is right now, and I feel that there have to be ways of encouraging growth without turning Arlington into Cambridge.
Thank you. Chris Loretti.
I didn't sign up to speak, Chair.
Okay, you were next on my list, and you often do, so I figured I'd give you the opportunity. I thought it might be an oversight. Joanne Preston.
I thought there were other people who wanted to speak before me.
Joanne Preston.
Good evening. I'm Joanne Preston. I live at 42 Mystic Lake Drive. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 9 and also a member of the Webb Cowett neighborhood group. So let's put the fear-mongering to an end with some facts. I need this, I think. Yeah, with some facts. I've been going to all the meetings since I went to this horrible meeting in December that an outside person was paid to come and run for us. Supposedly, we found out about this plan 4 days before it went to the ARB. So since then, I've been to the ARB meetings, the residential study group meetings, the housing implementation group meetings, the zoning bylaw working group, and several public forums. Out of that, I realized that there were some very important questions that hadn't been answered. The first one was, what happens when we put in what is called density zoning or upzoning? Other places have done it, and there in fact have been studies. And the gold standard one, and that is considered the best study, I just checked it out with our MIT researcher, she liked it, just came out in January. It was conducted by MIT researcher Johann Freemark and published in a peer-reviewed journal, Urban Affairs Review, January 31st this year. He looked at what happened after 5 years after these density zonings or upzoning measures such as the height, reduced parking and so forth, around certain neighborhoods in Chicago around transportation centers. So what did he find? No significant increase in housing production. Only lots of land speculation, which led to higher housing costs and increased rents and zero affordable housing. I think that's important to keep in mind because these are big changes. We want to know what's going to happen. And one way to know that is to look at studies of where it's been done elsewhere. There are similar studies that were done in New York, the same thing around transportation areas, high buildings, and they have the same outcome. In fact, there's a book out just a year ago called Zoning Out. And what they found out is that the areas where this is going to happen are the areas where the lower income people live and the more minority groups live, and they become more affluent and the people have to leave. Now, another question that comes up in different forms is one that has to do with supply and demand. Because you think, we get a lot more housing, rents have to go down. Well, that's not true, at least when we're just dealing with Arlington, for two reasons. One is that, and it was said at the ARB meeting, I give them credit for that we live in a big housing market. You can't just increase some housing in Arlington and have rents go down. It's the whole metropolitan area. So, but the second reason is, and this came out of the Harvard Joint Center, is that now there are a lot of affluent people who want to buy condos and apartments. And that's now a separate market. That is the most profitable market for building apartment buildings, you know, the kinds that have a workout room, a TV room, and all these amenities. That's what will be built. That means that the zones in Arlington, here on the map, are where people live in more modest apartment buildings. It is those people who are going to be displaced, Arlington residents. And I think that's very important. We want diversity, socioeconomic diversity in our town. We don't want these people to have to leave, and they'll never be able to afford the apartments that replace them. Now, third. Where did these density proposals come from? I was really surprised on December 17th to hear of them. We've heard a lot in the last hearing here about the master plan. So I've looked at the master plan, and we find that master plan says a number of different things, but one thing it did stress was the need for green space, the need for usable green space. That means it's not on the roof where these articles say it would be. So I urge you all to go look at the 100-page master plan, and you will see that in it. And also, I was kind of surprised the way people talk about the master plan. It's not set in stone. It was done on data 5 or 6 years ago. Since then, we've had a lot of concerns about climate change, which these street canyons will not prevent but exacerbate with the new winds and storms and so forth. Things can change. This is what surprises me. We have the US Constitution, which is being reinterpreted and amended. Just because we have a master plan that suggested some building, doesn't mean we have to do it 6 years later or 7 years later. I'm also a little concerned about the process because I live here, I'm pretty active in things. I knew nothing about this till December 17th.
We're getting far out of scope, Ms. Preston. Please bring it back to these articles.
The process isn't.
We're talking about these articles.
Not to do that, it's not polite, and it's not done in town. I don't know why you have a mallet there. You can speak, but you don't have to bang things with a mallet.
I will run the meeting. Thank you for your input. Please keep it in scope, Ms. Preston. I'll let you continue.
Well, part of
Please keep it in scope, and I'll let you continue.
Okay, the process is what several people have addressed
And
already.
we understand that it's been addressed, and you've had the opportunity to address it several times. I have a long list of people that would like to speak this evening.
This is censorship.
I think it is too. That's my last point. Thank you. I think we should put aside this density plan that came, I think, from outside consultants. And I think we should develop a new process with neighborhood planning. We want some development, but what development will be best for your neighborhood? You're the people who would know that. And there are all sorts of other things, land trusts, cooperative housing, co-housing, and neighborhood groups can get together with local businesses. This is the kind of process that will bring vibrancy to Arlington, not higher rents, displacements, and street walls. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol Curcio.
I will, thank you. Yep, I see it. Hi, everyone. My name is Carol Henry Curcio, and I am a third-generation Arlingtonian, and I am also a real estate agent. I am just here, and it's really my first time, so I'm really kind of bummed out about that because I wish I was here earlier. I think the articles sound amazing. I think it's something that should go forward. I remember when my grandfather came here from Ireland, he worked on Wyman Farm. And back then, the fear of selling out that land and building Cowan Manor, I'm sure kind of had the same feeling that we're having here. But I think the work, the way it's presented, is pretty exciting to me. To my children who grew up here, my daughter's 26, she would love to be able to just walk down the center, hang out, have multi-use buildings to go to. So that's really it. Thank you, and I appreciate all your hard work. I hope to be around for several more meetings now. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Moore.
None of that addressed any of the articles.
If you'd like to speak, please sign up and I'll give you an opportunity to speak.
Christopher Moore, 80 School Street, and member of town meeting. With the articles that we're talking about right now, my main concern is that it's unclear for someone who hasn't been as involved as all of you have been, and unfortunately, town meeting has to weigh in this kind of thing here, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. It's unclear to me, for each of these changes, what's wrong with the present, why this particular change as opposed to some other nearby change, you know, why one space per unit, for instance, not 1.5, 1.1, whatever, and what impact are we trying to achieve with each change? Now, the presentation that we had at the beginning of the meeting today talked fairly generally about the kinds of things we're trying to accomplish. But since we vote on these at town meeting one by one, it feels like we really need to have a justification and understanding of why this change and what do we expect to be the outcome of this particular change. for each of these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan Nyberg.
Hi, good evening. Jonathan Nyberg, Lakeshore Drive. I'm a realtor in town. I've also fixed up a lot of houses and I've developed some things. So I've done a little bit of everything and I'm looking at this from different perspectives. With all due respect, I think it's fair to say that the average age in this room is probably 65 and up. And many of us, reality, we're not going to be here in 20 years. And yes, we're trying to make decisions, input and influence on the future of Arlington. For most people, the older we get, the harder and the scarier change is. We are looking to help Arlington move forward, even though, like I said, we may not be here. I've only been here for 28 years, but I've seen a lot of change, which has made Arlington a much more vibrant town than it was 28 years ago. As John Warden stated, we are talking about a small percentage of Arlington. With over about 11,000 residents, we're talking about probably a few hundred properties on Mass Ave and the other areas. Is change going to affect people differently? Absolutely. Are some of the people going to be hurt, like Don said? Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's part of change and progress. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but to be fair, I feel as though we need to make decisions that will best affect the majority, not the minority. Do we penalize the majority of people in Arlington, young and old, to placate the minority? I feel like this, what we're being presented, is a proactive way to move our town forward. And also I think it will help our town create additional revenues that we do need, and we are going to need. And a lot of us don't want our taxes doubled or tripled, but we don't have any other form of revenue. So I think it's a fairly big picture, holistic way of looking at multiple issues. And I just wanted to say, sometimes we say those developments on Broadway, or those things on Mass Ave, or those houses that maybe we wouldn't want to live in. We live in Jason Heights, we live on Mystic Lakes. But I can probably find 5,000 people who would love to live in any of those properties on Broadway, etc. So I think we need to be a little maybe kinder and more open-minded towards different people's aesthetic, but still trying to help house other Arlingtonians, other people in Massachusetts, etc. So thank you.
Thank you. Janice Broadman.
Hi, my name is Janice Broadman. I live on Pine Street in Arlington. I think that we are talking about specific amendments, but this is really based on some kind of vision for Arlington and what we expect. And that I think there's a lot of divergence between what the ARB envisions and what a lot of people maybe in Arlington envision. Unfortunately, I think probably if we looked at the objectives, we might all agree. We want more affordability. We want people to be able to move here and have different income groups. We want a bigger tax base. We want a beautiful town where people can enjoy walking around, where they like to shop, where they like to dine. But I think that the way you get there, our ideas about how you get there are really different. And a lot of what's embodied in these measures really won't get us there. Some people already talked about that in terms of density leading to affordability. We know that doesn't happen. I mean, that's just a fact of life, especially in the sort of a town like Arlington next to Boston and Cambridge. Somerville, I was just in Somerville the other night visiting a friend. It's unbelievably dense near Sullivan Station, incredible. And rents are sky high, and they've been climbing since then because people want to live close to Boston. So yes, we might agree on objectives, but I don't think we agree, and I think that the measures that are taken are theoretical, but not based on fact, not based on experience of a lot of other cities, a lot of other towns around. Not only here, I'm in economic development. I've been doing it for 30 years in the US and overseas. I've worked for the World Bank, I've worked for a lot of places. I look at these and they just don't fit what I know reality to be. In talking about tax base, you have to also look at costs. And I think people aren't realizing that there's going to be huge costs involved in a lot of the things we're doing for the long term. So promoting businesses. Why are businesses moving from Arlington to Lexington, which they have been? Because Lexington has wide streets, it's beautiful to walk in, it's really pleasant, and we're talking about making it less pleasant, less sidewalk cafes and places where people want to just stroll and walk and shop. Frankly, I think doing something like this, which has huge town implications, making the decision through the ARB and town meeting, with all due respect, I think is the wrong process. I was a town meeting member. I was on SNAC, the Sims Neighborhood Action Committee. I've been to the meetings about Mill Street, the Mill Street development. My experience has been that once the ARB decides something, town meeting members seem to tend to go along with it, and once the decision has been made within the group, that nothing we say is going to change that. They've done what they think is best, and it's very hard to change your mind and change your approach once you've spent a lot of time doing that. For something, and when we have an increase in taxes, we have a ballot, a town-wide ballot. Why are we talking about changing the entire tone of this town, the entire character of this town, and doing it through a small group of people? We should be, and the meetings are all very well, but believe me, I've been in these meetings. I have not found yet any meeting to really change the outcome. And I went to dozens of meetings around Sims and around Mill Street. We should have a ballot, a town-wide ballot that asks whether people throughout the town, not just those people who are over 65, if you think that's the median age here, but see whether people agree with the way we're talking about achieving. I think we agree on the goals, but how are we in agreement on the way we're talking about meeting the goals?
Thank you. We're going to take a brief recess, and we'll come back. If you have not signed up to speak, please come up and do so. We'll come back at 9:10. Carl Wagner is going to be the first speaker after the break. I have you over here.
How you doing?
I'm watching an ACMi.
I'd stay here after I did talk in the beginning.
I know, and I didn't know that. I signed another sheet. Oh, this is me right here.
Okay, good. So let's call it.
What number are you up to now?
I am here. So I have a few.
Okay, so it's this.
I know you've been here. I don't know.
I haven't been in yet, and some of the sticky on the wall.
I think we
And then I know at least one who wanted to talk about the bicycle stuff.
I agree. I have those people.
Yeah, I didn't look at last week's. Well, I just, I'm not going to say I don't think that parking reduction is necessarily one of the things, but I don't keep time.
I promised everyone
All right, folks, we're going to get back started. We still have a lot of people who would like to speak, more articles to discuss. Please take your seats. Once everybody's back in their seats and quieted down, please, Carl Wagner has the podium.
Microphone.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Carl Wagner. I live on Edge Hill Road. I'm a town meeting precinct 11 town meeting member. I wanted to speak about these specific articles, but first of all, I wanted to ask how many of the room are actually town meeting members, if you could raise your hands. So that's good, there's some, because the rest of you, I hope you know that you won't get to choose about this. They'll be choosing for you. And I hope that those of you that are here, I guess those of you that are here, are getting informed or telling us your opinions. That's very important. I hope that all the town meeting members are aware of this. Sometimes we sleep or knit or whatever, but I really think it's important that they be aware of this, because the rest of us will not get to vote. I heard a concern which is sort of nasty, I think, saying that there are just 15 of those people out there that are making a lot of noise about what the director of planning and town manager are putting through here. I guess I'm one of the 15. I run the website for the Gang of 15's Arlington Residents for Responsible Redevelopment. And by the way, let's make it more than 15. Please go to our website. You can sign up for news and updates, and you can learn more about the developments here. So I thought I'd put a plug in since we were attacked a little bit there. It really isn't just 15 people. As I went out handing out flyers, I have about 20 more if you want to see them, to people in my precinct this weekend. Inevitably, everyone who opened their door said, "Oh, this is interesting, thank you, I had no idea. Some of you were here, thank you for coming." The concern specifically I'd like to talk about would be the 11 article, height buffer area. It's hard to imagine what really some of these things mean. We've heard that solar panels will be affected. We've heard that large buildings will be closer to smaller buildings, i.e. the rest of us that live here. I need to declare all my interests. I work at night to make enough money to live here. I work at night for a solar hot water company and do the reporting, so it pisses me off that electric and solar hot water panels will be in the darkness sometimes, and just people's windows, kitchen windows will be in the darkness from these 5 or 6 floor buildings. So what do I mean specifically about Article 11, height buffer area? If some of you know the fish market on Summer Street at the end of this really nice single-family zone that I get to live in, and I'm so thankful for Arlington for that, whatever second or first family you live in or wherever you live. Well, that fish market looks like this nice little place, but according to, I believe, Don Seltzer has given me some information and some research I've done, that 27,000 square foot lot could have 27 apartments. And I believe, if this goes through, and under the new rules, I believe it could be 4 floors high, with basically very little building buffer between the poor neighbors in their 2-floor houses right behind, and very little buffer, if any, on the street of Summer Street. Just 4 floors are going right up, or 3 floors going right up, and a setback for the 4th floor. Now, I also heard from Mr. Seltzer, because he knows a lot, and he's a great resource, and he's believable on this, unlike some of the other stuff I've heard.
Let's keep it respectful, Mr.
Sorry,
Wagner.
yeah, that wasn't directed at you specifically.
Let's keep it respectful to everyone, please.
I've heard that this 27,000 square foot lot, magically under the new rules, if it's divided into 13,000 minier lots, then they can go up an extra floor. What the heck? You make it smaller lot-wise and you can go even higher? And the same is true at the Gulf gas station, the Dunkin' Donuts, and the Mini Moves place. That's collectively 34,000 square feet, or 34 apartments, cut it up different ways, and shockingly, you get 5 floors. Also, under the new rules, they could make smaller lot sizes, and they could actually exclude the affordable apartment unit that would come on the 6th unit, because they could do it in 5,000 square foot lots. But that isn't part of 11 or 13. Let me move on to 13. 13 is the parking restriction. I don't know if any of you saw recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Boston Globe had an interesting article. It talked about Cambridge. Cambridge recently, as you all know, the People's Republic of Cambridge is very bicycle and non-car friendly, but they had to admit to the Globe that they have been unable to get car ownership down below 1.5 cars per unit, and they are the lowest car per unit ownership in the state. And I think the 1.8 numbers that Mr. Kappeline quoted are probably closer to the truth, although 1.4 is close to 1.5. Needless to say, 1.5 cars is not one. And by saying to the poor people who rent these very expensive new units, oh, you can only have one place, they're not just gonna, one car place, they're not just gonna only own one car. It's gonna spill out, it's gonna be a problem, it's gonna be a snow parking problem, it's gonna be the end of quiet streets where people can walk without worrying about the situations you see in the streets where cars are there all the time. I also want to say that remember, people like me who bike every day, or like Mr. Warden and me who take the bus every day. By the way, can I just say, I think we should applaud lawyers who take public transit to work and come to meetings like this. I think that's wonderful. I wish I were that. I'm not. But what I wanted to say is, it's about parking of cars. It's not about limiting them limiting people from using them in the sense that they own. What am I trying to say is that I actually right now have a small car problem, and I have 4 cars in my driveway. I drive 0 of them to work. I'm a Cambridge person. Cambridge owns 1.5 cars and they need to park them, and we will need to park our 2 or 3 cars or whatever it is. I believe the current law for parking, for this, bringing me back to Article 13, allows the ARB to reduce the 2 current required parking spaces to 1 in special circumstances anyway. So 13 is totally unnecessary, since we need 1.4 or 1.5 cars and they can reduce it. Why reduce it for 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, multiple adults down to 1 car? They're just going to hate each other, and I just think it's crazy. So I hope that you'll consider the issues of 11 and 13 as just totally anti-Arlington. I also would say people who were not involved in these articles being drafted, which is all of us, can go and look at October 1 on the wonderful ACMi website, where you can see the whole video where we were supposed to be there to help draft them. And this is also great to see last week's, March 11th, but October 1 of 2018 is very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Pasi Mietinen.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Pasi Mietinen. I'm a resident of Arlington for 17 years and live on Sheraton Park in East Arlington. I have 2 points, one principal position and an economic argument in favor of the articles, and hoping that ARB will support them. And the principal position for me is that we've trying to think of a best way to frame it. The principal position is that we've had a town meeting that has asked for these articles in its master plan. And it asked to be presented, and this is simply a representation of that request to be discussed in town meeting and debated over there. So to me, this is a principal position, is that ARB should support these articles in order to let the town meeting decide. I completely agree, this is town meeting's decision. So from a principal point of view, this should go to the town meeting because this is what they requested in the master plan. Now, the second point, the economic point, is more closer to home to me. And by the way, even if the ARB members wouldn't represent and wouldn't agree with the articles, I still think that it belongs in the town meeting for a town meeting to discuss and debate it. On the economic front, we have a school building that is going to cost a lot of money. The residents' share of that high school building is north of $200 million potentially.
Let's keep it away from the school.
Yes, I apologize. The point of it is that we're this year, those of us who live in East Arlington, in Calvin Manor neighborhood, realized a 36% tax increase. That hit home, made me realize what the economic consequences of all the investments that we're making into the future of the town. What that to me, then when I look at the development plan for the commercial corridors, I look at that as a source of revenue that will lower my taxes. For me, this meant $4,000 increase this year in taxes. So all the economic development, and for example, I would gladly move my company to Arlington if suitable office space were available. So simply from an economic point of view, I think there's an opportunity to reduce the taxes for the residents, and those increases will be substantial, and I think we should be mindful of what the benefits, those economic benefits of that development will bring to the town. Thank you.
Thank you. Park Wild.
Hi, my name is Park Wilde. I'll answer to Wild though, and various variations of that. I'm a 15-year resident of Arlington and raised my family here. And aside from just the details of what height of building gets the setback and what number of yards is the buffer and what number of cars, I think about the different people who are affected by this. And this is what leads me to want to speak in favor of these proposals. I think about the teachers, the people who work in retail as cashiers in our stores. I think about all the working people who are part of our lives, and I ask myself, why can't they afford to live here? And it's because at different stages of life, people are able to afford a single-family home or one condo and a duplex, and at an earlier stage of life, they need to live in an apartment for a while. And if we want everybody to live in the same town, I think we have to provide more housing that's modest in size. I think about low-income people, right? And everybody says, what does this have to do with housing affordability? But to me, it seems very obvious. I'm an economist. I've heard people here sort of doubting that if there were actually more apartments, that apartments would be more affordable. But that one seems so clear to me, that there's a connection between how much is supplied and what is the price. But even beyond that, there's a set aside for affordability that kicks in when there's 6-unit buildings. And so unless we allow developers to build buildings at a certain level of density, then other rules that we've sort of in our wisdom put into place in the past for housing affordability aren't going to come into application. I think about my parents who moved here from Florida, not because they wanted our winters, but because they needed to be close to family, and they needed an apartment right close to a corridor that was good for walkability. How many apartments like that were there that my parents could have had, like they had on Massachusetts Avenue, that put them in walking distance to our church congregation, Calvary Church? We need more like that, not less. I think about my kids, and so then this is where my heart really goes into this set of proposals, because our kids have to grow up during a time of climate change. And when we think about climate change, everybody thinks we're talking about like plastic straws and even the solar panels on our roof. But the things that affect climate change most are the big ones. What do we eat? How much goods do we consume? And what is our transportation? And for the transportation, unless we provide more housing for people who are living on the bus corridor, want to travel from Alewife to jobs in Boston, unless we make the density sufficient to support the bus traffic and to get people out of their cars, we're not going to be able to change with the times in a way that's going to be needed. And of course, we have to plan now for what the next generation is going to need in years to come. Remember that these changes are not all mandates. They're really, in some cases, about what's mandated, and in some cases about what's permitted. And especially in a time of climate change, the idea that our town zoning would require developers to have more car spaces than they want seems to me really outrageous. It's not that you're not allowed to have 2 car spaces. The developers are allowed to have 2 car spaces if they think in order to market it to a particular set of buyers or renters, they need 2 car spaces. But the idea that we would tell a family, and I speak on this as somebody who now, just this week, the 4th person in our family got their driver's license. So my teenage daughter, and this is frightening, I know, to all of you, my teenage daughter got her driver's license this week. And so we're a family of 4 with 1 car, because we get everywhere by bus and by public transportation. And I don't see why developers should be told as a matter of rule that they have to provide more parking spaces than that. I understand everybody's fears. I listened, and I really appreciate the process, both for the ARB and for the town on all of this. And so I listened with such an open heart to all the fears that people are expressing about change in this town. But if you ask me, I would encourage the ARB to think about all the different types of people who are going to be affected by the decision you make here, and to favorably consider these proposals.
Thank you. Aram Holman.
Alan Holman, 12 Whitmore Street, Arlington, Massachusetts. I have a couple of comments, some on specific articles, some more in general. May I respond without naming names to comments previously made?
Keep them within scope and be respectful.
Oh, absolutely. One comment that was made earlier this evening was that our business spaces are too small. And that was an argument for allowing expansion upwards of the business districts. My response is that businesses can do what Acetron and and Punjab did, which is they can knock out the spaces separating small hole-in-the-wall units and combine them. Both those restaurants did that. Both those restaurants are doing very, very well because they took that risk. It is one thing to expand spaces, and I agree that the current holes in the walls are not adequate for businesses anymore. But you need to build out and combine existing spaces. You do not need to build up. That's simply not necessary. You don't need to demolish whole buildings and build them from the ground up to a greater height and density. The only people who benefit from that are landlords and developers. May I mention the housing production plan? I believe it's relevant.
In context, please.
Okay. I think that one of the factors driving this zoning change is Arlington's housing production plan, the origin of which seems to be a little bit mysterious. And the deal, as I understand it, is that if Arlington increases for a number of years straight, the number of affordable units that it creates by between 0.5% and 1%, i.e. between 98 and 196 units, then the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development will basically exempt us from the Chapter 40B blackmail that we are currently under. The problem with that is that that's simply not realistic. If you look at what it takes to build housing in Arlington, anything of a project of 100 units or more, there have only been 3 of them in the last several years. The Brigham, the MyRac project, and Sims 360. And they have all taken years. This is the kind of thinking which would make sense in a community with a lot of vacant land. But that's not Arlington. We're all built out. We can't do that, and that kind of housing production, much as we might like it for affordable housing, simply is not going to happen. But the zoning changes that are proposed to be put in place to potentially enable that will allow big profits for developers. And I think that's what's driving it. We will not get 100 to 200 units per year. Even if developers did their 1 in 6 and didn't scheme to evade those in the way that many people have already described, for instance, subdividing lots, even if they strictly and honestly adhered to that 1 in 6, to build 100 units of affordable means you have to build 600 units of housing. And I believe in the last 20 years, Arlington has built less than 1,000 units total. So I don't think that's going to happen. We're not that kind of vacant land kind of place. There's an issue of scale here. My mother's family grew up in Brooklyn, and on Coney Island you have shops on the first floor and 3 more stories above that, but you had a big, wide boulevard. And it could support 4 stories on either side. And it was big and wide, and it made sense. Arlington is not quite as big as Brooklyn, New York. And Mass Ave can support 3 stories on both sides. And if we needed zoning changes that would allow places which are not 3 stories to go up to there, I think I just might support those. Most of our houses go up 3 stories, a lot of buildings do, but I believe a lot of that can already be done by right. I don't know how much is actually needed for that. But once you go up to 4 stories, it's too big, it's too tall. People have brought up the objections, the shadows, the congestion that will result from that many more people. We're already at 8,800 people or so per square mile. More if you count the fact that a good chunk of our area is water. That's really enough. You're just not going to do more than that. Finally, to a specific article, I'm also opposed to the reduction in parking in some areas to 1 space per 5 units. It simply makes no sense, even for elders who have decided to giving up driving. Let's be honest. The reason for cutting the required spaces has nothing to do with energy conservation or with easing traffic congestion. It is simply and exclusively a means to allow developers to build additional units rather than parking. And I will cite the example of the Myrack project, which is near where I live, when, because it was supposedly smart growth and on a transit line, they asked for a 20% reduction in required parking. I believe it was from 1.5 to 1.25 spaces per unit. That place is still pretty full of cars. And Arlington is still pretty congested. And you're not going to get a whole lot of anything except more and dense units by cutting that out. You will simply intensify the competition for parking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ajia Kepka.
How many more?
Hello, my name is Asha Kepka. I live on Silk Street. 20-year resident of Arlington, previously from Poland. A couple issues I'd like to address. First of all, I need to respond to, I'm one of the gang of 15, and I'm proud of it. I actually wish that everybody who spoke here had a little bubble over them to show the location where they live. Because I know some people are real estate agents making good money, they have good income, and they can move, they can have nice area around their homes. Some people are city employees living around, surrounded by conservation land in undervalued rental properties. I'm not one of them. I actually live in East Arlington, and my street is very vibrant, colorful, people of different ethnicities, people different incomes. And I'd like to address the walkability, sort of green, reducing the carbon footprint. People say, oh, we should just bike everywhere. If we put bike stands, people will bike. And that's not true. I go to Poland where my 78-year-old mother bikes everywhere. Everybody in the small town in Poland bikes. And they bike because it's easy, convenient, and it's safe. I wanted to bike because, you know, I'm middle-aged, getting a little chubbier. It's dangerous to bike here. My roommate was biking, she was hit by a car. She stopped biking. No amount of bicycle parking things will increase the number of people biking, because honestly, Arlington and Cambridge and this area is not really safe for biking. I admire people who do, and I'd love to bike, but it's not reality for most of us. Parking, I would like to find out where the excess parking is, because one of the issues I have with, I'm a landlord, and a good one, I don't like to raise rent, I really don't. One of the issues we have in East Arlington, there isn't sufficient parking for people. We have a long, narrow driveway, and I only have space for one parking spot for a tenant. So a lot of times I can't rent the apartment to people who have 2 cars. So, and I don't know anybody on my street who has too much of parking. Yes, there might be parking lots somewhere else in the Heights where, you know, nice people live, but we don't have excess parking in East Arlington. And I know that some things we can control, like transportation, you know, the buses, blah, blah. Just different things. I live right off Broadway and near Route 16. Last week I'm in my bedroom and boom, I hear an accident. It happens all the time. It is such a difficult intersection, and people say, well, Broadway, you know, Highway 2, you know, Somerville, blah, blah. It's a very congested intersection. You can turn left coming from Route 16 onto Broadway, coming from Boston. And I can hear accidents all the time. Sometimes I even call 911 because I know it's an accident and I see flashing lights. So it's not, I know we can't really control many things, but we have to devise our planning around the existing situation of difficult transportation, public transportation, which isn't ideal, and also the car traffic. The last point I want to make is I know we're talking about decreasing the space between the buildings, and I'm just speaking from a personal point of view. In 2008, when MyRac's building changed the commercial space and put the Leafy Clinic next to me, somebody threw a cigarette, and I wasn't home within 2 minutes. The whole back of my house was on fire. And the only reason my house was spared is because I had a stone patio. I came home to my whole garden being gone, my whole fence being gone. We live in wooden houses. It's really not ideal situation to put houses so close to each other without even having a green space or a wall or stone patio. It was really frightening, and it really shook me that if it wasn't for that stone patio, my house would be gone. I had burn marks on my back porch, and it happened so quickly. So for me, this is very personal. I live in East Arlington. Most of the residents who I spoke to were not aware of these changes. I live in the permanent shadow of a building next to me, which is the same height as my house. I can't imagine that building was twice as tall, 50 feet. So these are the changes that impact people from East Arlington, and I'd like people from the Heights to sort of understand our position. Thank you.
Thank you. Julia Myrack.
Hello, my name is Julia Myrack. My family has been in the town of Arlington. Oh, sorry. Should have known by now. My name is Julia Myrack, and my family has been in the town of Arlington, owned property since the early 30s when my grandfather bought a garage in the middle of Arlington Center. So we have a long history in the town, and it is our feeling and our belief that change is good. When you stay still, you're often going backwards. And it worries me that this town may end up going backwards because we're all, or some of us, a little afraid to go forward and to embrace change. I think that my family's history in the town has demonstrated that change can be good. My grandfather bought a building in the center of Arlington in the early 30s. It became an automobile dealership. It became successful. In the 80s, it then moved up into the Heights, which, if you were to look back on it now, you would probably think a car dealership doesn't belong in the center of Arlington anymore. And so the change, it was a big change, but it was a positive change, I think, for the town to move up to the Heights. Because of that move, we then donated the Jefferson Cutter House to the town, which then got moved to the center of town. And we now have this lovely place that houses the Cyrus Dallin Museum and Whittemore Park and the most recent beer gardens over the summer. And all those things, I think, have contributed to a happier, nicer place for the center of town. Around the year 2000, we took the property that used to have the dealership and we built a legacy at Arlington Center, which brought 134 households to the center of town, which helped create economic growth in the center of town and people to go to the restaurants and go to the shops and help support the town. And the legacy has actually turned out to be proof of the lack of need of so much parking. So at the time when the building was built and permitted, we have 136 units, and we were required to build 166 spaces, which is 1.2 per unit. 20 years later, we now have on average 30 to 35 spaces empty every single day. At the time that it was built in 2000, all the spaces were full. The Legacy has been consistently full. So we've had the same number of people living there, and over the course of 20 years, we've seen the parking go from a 1.2 ratio down to even. So we have 136 units now with, on average, 130 spaces being used every day. So that's not thinking and that's not opinion, that's fact. That we now have a 1-to-1 ratio with 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments. And in addition, we have 2 zip car spots that we rent out there. We have 2 zip car spots that we rent out at Broadway. So I think that talking about needing more parking, it's unrealistic. It's not necessary. Over the past 20 years, you've seen an absolute reduction in the number of spaces that are necessary for the same number of people to live. So I hope that the ARB will adopt these new zoning amendments. I think it's going to be great for the town. I think it's going to help promote growth. I think it's going to help promote diversity. And we're in favor of seeing this go through. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Chris Loretti.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chris Loretti, 56 Adams Street. I was going to confine my statements to the articles, but I would like to touch on a few things that previous speakers have said. Someone mentioned that they didn't think the town necessarily agreed with your vision for the town as presented in the master plan. I'm not sure of that because I'm not sure you have a vision. And as I said in the fall when I thought this process was moving too forward, I think you need to have that first, and I don't think we have it. The master plan has lots of items that are desired by different people. A lot of them are contradictory. And there has never been, that I've seen, an effort in this town since the master plan was finished to come up with a coherent vision that the town could get behind. And it's at that point when you get that vision established that you change the zoning. I don't see town meeting having come forward and asked for any of these zoning articles. That's not to say that they're all bad, but I don't see them as leading the charge for these changes. And I don't think the changes should be made until that vision's established. And certainly you're not going to get 100% buy-in. But I'll give you just a couple examples of what we have now. In saying in the master plan that development should be concentrated along the commercial corridors, well, does that mean entirely and equally along the corridors? Or does it mean it should be concentrated in the 3 business districts as the COF plan recommends? What the master plan actually recommended that, I should call it cost study. The master plan references that study and says something like, well, the town should pick the best recommendations out of that study and implement them. But I've never heard anyone say what those best recommendations are. And I think that gets to what I feel is the lack of vision before moving forward. The other thing I would like to say is I'm really glad to see a lot of the successful developers here tonight, including the Housing Corporation, the Myrack family. One of the things that shows is that these people have been successful in developing properties in the town under the existing zoning regime. And I think that raises the question of why you need significant changes when we already have so many successful developers in town. But let me turn now to the articles themselves. And in particular, I'll start with Article 10. This is one that, as far as it goes, I agree with what the MAPC proposed. I don't think that's what the article does, though. And I'm going to go back to something I have called Overview of Proposed Recommendations. I'm not quite sure what the date is on this. But what it says, and this is a recommendation, upper story setback applies above the 3rd story. But what the text of the bylaw change says is for buildings more than 4 stories, which suggests that the step backs only apply if you have a building of 5 stories or more. Now, I'm not sure whether that's what you intended or not, but that's the way it's written, so that if you had a 4-story building, a building that was just 4 stories, step back doesn't apply, as I read this. And I think you need to go back and fix that to make it consistent with what was recommended. On Article 11, I think this has been fairly well covered in the previous comments, and I think a lot of people were under the misimpression that because of these large numbers, 200, 150, 100 feet in the buffer areas, that actually limited how close the buildings could be to the property line. It doesn't. As a previous speaker said, it merely limits the height or reduces the height for buildings that fall within that zone. I was in Davis Square the other night. I think people ought to realize what the maximum height limit and story limit is in Davis Square. So I think most people would find that acceptable, at least in the major business districts of Arlington. The height limit there is 4 stories or 50 feet. It's not 5 stories and 60 feet. So to have what the buffer zone is saying in those cases is that you're limited to the heights allowed in Davis Square. You can't go higher than that, and nothing more. So I would suggest that this is a very reasonable limitation as it's written. One of the people who lives no longer in town, who was responsible for a very large part in the older existing bylaw, is Alan McLennan, the former planning director. And it's unfortunate we don't have the benefit of his presence here, as we go over these articles, I think, to share his wisdom, because there was a lot of thought put into these, and this one really should just stay as it is. And I would say the same with the next article as well. This is the one that pertains to corner lots and through lots. One of the things that people need to realize is it's very common along the commercial corridors to have the higher zone lots, the higher numbered business and residential lots, be only 1 lot deep on the street, which means for any of the side streets, the second lot in is a 1 or 2 family home. And what that means in this case, the way it is written now, is because in a lot of cases you reduce the front yard setback to 0, it means that the setback on that side street is going to be 0 as well. And frankly, I think that also has a real hazard that presents, because a lot of times driveways are going to be right next to at the side of the property line. It makes it very difficult for people coming out of those driveways to see when these buildings are right next to the property line. On the other hand, in cases like at Mass Ave at Medford Street, you are going to have commercial zones, on both the main street and the side street. And then the existing bylaw, as it's written, handles that, because what it says is the lots on the sides, the setbacks for the lot on the side street apply. So this is another one that really doesn't need to change. It offers a good protection to the 1 or 2 family homeowners in the adjacent lots, and I believe it should stay that way. Article 13 is the one on reducing the parking requirement. I would suggest that the title of this in the table where it says minimum number of spaces is really misleading. The numbers in this table are really just a starting point for negotiations. What these numbers really are the maximum number that the board can require. And I say that because these parking numbers only apply to properties that have to undergo a special permit. The developers or people involved will always be going before either the Redevelopment Board or the Zoning Board of Appeals. And as others have previously stated, those boards are empowered to reduce those numbers up to 75%. So what they're asking for is not really 1 unit per apartment. They're asking for the ability to have 0.25 parking spaces per unit. And I suggest there are probably very few developers who actually want that, few. One of the things I would recommend that the board do is, I think And actually, the other thing I wanted to say is this is a change that was made certainly after the legacy project in Arlington Center was constructed. I think the bylaw may well have changed perhaps after the master plan was completed, or certainly during the master plan development process. So you've already done your work. You've already checked this one off. I don't think it needs further reductions. Now, I would say you do have to do what's called the Transportation Demand Management Plan to get those increased reductions. One of the recommendations I would make is in the past, you could get a 20% reduction essentially just by asking for it. When the board implemented this greater change, they limited that 20% reduction to just the R0 to R4 zoning districts. I would suggest changing that back to the way it was to apply to all zoning districts, when subject to the special permit approval. And then if it's really that burdensome for developers to do the transportation demand management plan, you still have the opportunity to grant them relief as you did in the past. Article 14, I won't say too much about this. I mean, that's certainly, I suspect, was an oversight in the first place. And I don't have anything else I want to say about that. So I'll conclude my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sean Cherney. Sean, I have reached the end of my list of people that have signed up. So thank you all for your patience and being respectful of one another tonight. Appreciate it. I know every speaker does. If you are going to stick around for Article 21, which regards bicycle parking, please do so. If you are going to leave, please do so quietly as we have additional business to cover. Thank you all for coming tonight. Again, we'll have an additional public hearing on Monday. I will accept written comment up through Wednesday evening, but Monday will be the last time to appear at one of these meetings and comment in person on these. Thank you all for coming. And I'll move on to Article 21 once it's appropriate to do so. Yes, ma'am.
Very brief.
Sure, go ahead. We have one additional comment. I'm going to allow it.
Marion King.
Yeah, we still have one more speaker who notified me she wished to speak. So if we could please be quiet while she does so.
Marion King. I live on Decatur Street, and I'm a former resident of Menominee Manor. And I would just like to say that I am concerned with the restriction on parking because especially for low-income folks, there's often a need for more cars in a family as there are multiple generations occupying a household and multiple children coming of age that need to drive. I know that this was a problem in the manor many years back when there was a restriction of only one parking space per household. And many families became very indebted to the town of Arlington because they were ticketed every single night for cars that had to be parked on the street because there was no other parking. And, 1/3 of all of their income from the family was part of the rent that had to be paid to Arlington Housing Authority. I believe that now they are allowed more parking. However, this is a continuing problem for other people who are not even in housing authority, who are low income. And many of the low income housing people are in some of the high rises that are not necessarily very accessible to Mass Ave, and the bus on Broadway only runs 6 days a week, limited hours. So if people need to work, they can't access public transportation, and they do need cars. So I'm just concerned that there are instances, especially for affordable and low-income housing, when more parking is needed. And if there are places in town that have residual parking, perhaps there could be some arrangements made where there could be some affordable rental of parking arranged.
Thank you. I'm going to close Articles 10 through 14 now, continue those to next week, and move on to Article 21. Eric.
Hi, so bike parking. So the master plan recommends strengthening bicycle parking regulations in and adjacent to business districts and multifamily development. Our current standards are tied to motor vehicle parkings, and the net effect of that tie is that there's very little bicycle parking created in new developments. So the goal of this amendment is to decouple bicycle parking from motor vehicle parking. So the gist of the amendment, it establishes standards for long-term and short-term bicycle parking. Long-term bicycle parking would be an employee, a resident, someone who is going to be at a parcel or a lot of land for 8 hours or so. Short-term parking, maybe that's a shorter visit. Maybe it's also an overnight guest, but that's the division between, or the differences between long-term and short-term bicycle parking. So the amendment establishes general requirements and location standards for the new regulations around bike parking. And as many of our existing zoning provisions currently allow in the bylaw, modification of the standards can be accomplished by the ARB or the ZBA. So here's the amendment. I will note that it does say remove and replace the section in its entirety. So what you'll see, there were some copies, and I can pull up the amendments if that's desired by the board. But it's essentially striking the existing section and replacing it with the new standards that I briefly went through just now. That's it.
Thank you. Public comment for Article 21. Mr. Revelak.
Yes. Watching the cords.
Thank you.
So the problem, wouldn't want to knock the camera over.
No.
That would just make everybody's evening bad. Steve Revelak, Sunnyside Avenue. Bicycle parking. My bicycle is my main mode of transportation. I ride all year round, generally about 100 and some odd miles a week. And I'm really excited to see more bicycle parking. Well, or at least proposals to it. A few things in this that I would just like to say thanks for putting in the proposal. One would be section E5, which would basically, in particular, the section says bicycle racks designed to hold a bicycle by its front wheel alone shall not be considered to meet the bicycle parking requirements in this section. Thank you so much. Those racks are, some of them really are not meant for holding bicycles, but anyway. I would also like to commend you for the requirement that bicycles, you prohibit, or for the prohibition of requiring you to lift a bicycle off the ground floor without assistance. For larger bicycles, cargo bikes, which can be 50 or 60 pounds, and then more when loaded, being able to roll in is a nice thing. And finally, I'd like to thank you for recognizing the different use cases for long-term and short-term bicycle parking. There are really, they are two different cases, and they warrant two different sets of treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Warden again. I have no problem with the revised bicycle parking arrangements or requirements. But I do have an issue with bicycles, and that is, I don't know if you can get at it with this article, but if the winter ever gets over and the snow stops coming and the ice all really melts away, it hasn't happened yet, but hopefully it will. The Lime bicycles will reappear, and I really think that we need some regulation of where they are left. I've found them in front of people's houses, blocking sidewalks, all kinds of awkward places. It's one thing to put them in front of the town hall or something like that where there's plenty of space, but I don't think they should be just promiscuously left lying around in the neighborhoods. So I would hope maybe we can get at that issue under bicycle parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Good evening, my name is Christian Klein. I'm a resident of 54 Newport Street, town meeting member, precinct 10. Following up on Steve's comments, primarily being also a year-round cyclist, I think that this is a great improvement on what we currently have in town. One of the easiest to see examples of bike parking that doesn't work is Stop and Shop. Stop and Shop was required to have bicycle parking as a part of their thing. The rack is entirely unusable and remains unused, and by law it was supposed to have been actually physically attached to the ground, and it migrates all up and down the store. So what we need is parking that we can rely on and that we can reliably secure a bicycle to, so that when I put a trailer behind my bike and go to the grocery store, I can be assured that my bike will be there when I get back, which I currently do by attaching it to the signs that for the fire lane, because the bike rack's unusable. So I appreciate that we're going to have minimum standards for what actually qualifies as a bike rack. I get that, for me, that's the main sticking point on it, is I think that that's really what this town has needed, and I'm looking forward to vast improvements on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comment regarding Article 21, bicycle parking? Any comment from the board? We have time this evening. Gene?
Just a couple, but I think this needs a lot more work. I don't think it's where it needs to be yet, but I think it's headed in the right direction. One problem I think I have with it is in A, where the bicycle parking is subject to developments that require environmental design review, or any use requiring 8 or more vehicle parking spaces. That excludes a lot of places that I think should be required to have bicycle parking. I don't really understand the sentence in D that got added. You have the chart that says the minimum number of sentences, but right above that it says, when bicycle parking is required, there shall be a minimum of 2 bicycle spaces provided, and then we have a whole list that has fewer than 2 bicycle spaces provided. So it seems to me to be internally contradictory there. I also would like to see this split up into residential parking and what's required for residential parking, and then what's required for non-residential parking, because I think the requirements can and should be different and set out separately. And I think it's getting there. I think it needs more work. I think we need to require more bicycle parking spaces that are here. 1 space per dwelling unit makes no sense to me when you've got 2 or 3 bedroom units and people have 2 or 3 bicycles in it. So I think we're sort of replicating the problem we may be creating if we reduce the number of auto parking spaces. We're not starting off, I think, with enough bicycle parking spaces. I'd prefer to have more, as I suggested in my comment, and then allow either the ZBA or ARB to reduce the number if it can be shown that people won't be using bicycles in that place, for example. You know, it could be a lot of reasons. So I think we're getting there. I think it's great to have. I think it needs more work.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments? David, Ken?
The only comment I had is if they can just do a quick description of was the space allocated for bike parking.
You mean square footage space?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, like it's 18 inches wide by 4 feet,
Yeah.
and then some sort of
The dimensional requirements.
yes, just something, because otherwise it's kind of vague.
Can you address that, David?
Well, I know this is something that I was talking about with the department recently, and there are a couple of different ways, at least a couple of different ways of approaching this. One is at a pretty high level, which is where this is right now, with a follow-on guide that would provide detailed bike parking guidelines to be produced outside of the bylaw that would be adopted by the department at a later date, hopefully as soon as possible. The other approach would be one, and I would say, for instance, Cambridge has taken this approach in addition to having a very detailed bike parking guide, which is to put a lot of those details in their ordinance. It's really a question of how we want to approach it. I think the concern with putting too much detail at the bylaw level is we don't want to unnecessarily eliminate flexibility in the design of the specific facility. So we have to find the right balance, and I'm not sure where that is yet. I think that's something we can continue to work on, since we do have some additional things that aren't quite there yet with this proposal.
I'm asking.
Yes.
If someone's gonna build something, just want an idea of what the requirements are, as opposed to having it kind of vague and say, well, you come to us and we'll tell you what you think you need.
Yeah.
And then what we're all trying to do here is just try to encourage growth in a way where everybody sort of understands it.
Yeah.
And I'm not asking for very detailed. I think just something simple. If it's going to be on the ground, at least give it 18 inches wide by 4 feet or 5 feet, or I'm not sure what number it is. You know the number better than I do.
So the complexity is, there's actually a whole chart of this in Cambridge's standards, because they're all different kinds of bikes, and they actually require different dimensions for about 12 different kinds of bikes. So it starts getting complicated.
Okay.
You know, I do think we need to provide better guidance, and I think we've seen this in the hearings that we've done on special permits for projects where we have required bike parking, and the project proponents have definitely been getting better at coming to us with more well thought out proposals, but they definitely need even more specific guidance. I absolutely agree with you. I'm just not, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we need to put it in the bylaw as opposed to having a really good guide that we will adopt as a follow-on to the bylaw that will have, you know, all the different design options in it.
I'm flexible enough. I just
And the nice thing about doing it in the guide is, as things change over time, the department can quickly change the guide without the necessity of going back to town meeting to change the bylaw, just because some of the standards related to bike parking have changed.
Thank you. All right. So, table that discussion to the 27th, along with everything else from this evening. If there are any other comments, we will, of course, accept those future meeting. So I am going to close the public hearing for this evening. Move on to meeting minutes, which we were handed prior to this meeting. I'm going to table that until we all have an opportunity to review those, put those on the agenda for a future meeting. Jenny, I do want you to post them at least in draft form so that they're out there, recognize that they're completed. And with nothing else on the agenda this evening, I will take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Continue the hearing. Continue the public hearing. Motion to adjourn. Do I have a
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.